Hi, my name is James Hudson. I'm a performance nutritionist at Gloucester Rugby Club, and I'm going to be speaking to you on applied perspective on recovery in elite sport and keeping the athlete healthy. So my current role in sport is in collision team sports and rugby union. So there are special considerations that we need to think about when we're applying recovery strategies across a whole season that I'm going to speak to you about now. The mantra that I like to try and adopt with athletes in collision sports is especially around match day. So the season lasts for around 9 months of the year, and we want to make sure that athletes can perform every single week in, week out throughout the season. And it's really easy for athletes sometimes to get the idea that just by being fueled on a match day, that's all they need to worry about and they can perform on a day. But actually, if we can ensure that athletes are healthy throughout the entire season, we can make sure they can perform every single day of training, which has a huge knock-on effect to their ability to stay injury-free and manage to actually perform week in, week out throughout the season. So we try and make sure they present themselves to training every day, able to train fully and undergo the full training load we want them to. But to do that, we need to keep them healthy. So recovering week in, week out is a huge element of our nutrition strategies. So when we defined actually what are the demands on these athletes, we need to think about, as I've already mentioned, it's a hugely intense calendar of matches. So they can play for up to 47 weeks of the year, undergoing pre-season and up to 39 games in the season. They'll only have 5 weeks off during the year of complete rest. So we need to make sure that, again, they understand the intensity they're going to be under. In terms of the actual sport, rugby union is a very high intensity, repeated effort match play game, where we're expecting athletes to be able to perform these repeated high intensity efforts for at least 80 minutes every single match. We sometimes have to cope with short turnarounds between games. So again, if we've got matches maybe on a Sunday and we've got a following Friday night, we've got to make sure that the recovery is optimal to get that short turnaround and make sure they're recovered. We've also got to contend with foreign travel. And we also can't forget that they're under a huge mental load around any times during the season where they've got injuries, strain around selection and contractual short-term contract dealing. So there are lots of different aspects to look after these athletes and make sure that they are coping with the load upon them. But what I like to do is to try and separate their recovery into an acute phase immediately around match play and then a chronic phase throughout the season, which I'm going to speak to you about today. It's important that we also define how physical performance is measured. So we want to, as I've mentioned, make sure that they can undergo lots and lots of high intensity efforts, and to be able to physically perform those every week, we want to make sure that their body composition is retaining high levels of lean mass to make sure we're winning collisions, because that's one of the biggest aspects of rugby union. But we also need to make sure that the number of high intensity efforts is measurable during a match, and the players get fed back in terms of information on their physical performance and how they've managed to repeat those efforts. We want to make sure as well that in matches we're able for them to hit top levels of their acceleration and their velocity in match play, obviously translating that from training. And again, those body composition profiles for athletes are going to be around their position-specific aspects of the match play as well. So really the acute phase, immediately post-match, you can't get away from the real core foundations, and that doesn't change whatever happens, okay? That's something we've got to make sure we get right every single game. So that the traditional 4 R's of recovery really focuses around their macronutrient intake immediately post-game. So the first one, in terms of rehydration, obviously we're going to have really varying sweat losses in a match, which are going to contribute to fatigue during the latter stages of match play. But then we need to make sure we recover those immediately afterwards. And we can monitor those with really simple tools, traditionally just measuring body weight post-match compared to pre-game, look at fluid losses and make sure athletes are completely aware of how much fluid they need to replace in the next 24 to 36 hours, and also their choice of fluids around that. In terms of repairing muscle damage, we need to make sure that we're getting regular protein portions into them. So again, easily digestible sources, palatable, making sure that, again, the athletes want to regularly get those portions in over that next 24 hours, and especially that first 3 to 6 hours after a match. Again, this is especially important because of the high levels of muscle damage that these athletes are undergoing. In terms of refueling muscle stores of glycogen, so their carbohydrate intake is imperative immediately post-game, and we want to, again, make sure that that's palatable and easily done by the athletes. So using liquid and solid foods at regular intervals. Again, following the guidelines, we're going to be aiming for around 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo of carbohydrate, but translating that into easily available snacks and foods in the changing rooms immediately post-game, and then an hour to an hour and a half later, having a whole food meal, and then nudging them again to make sure they repeat that once they get away from the ground. So make sure we try and get 3 good refueling opportunities before rest in the evening. Now, again, there are considerations around this in terms of the individual and around when the next competition is going to be. The fourth element of our 4 R's is always rest. Okay, making sure that their rest time away from the ground and away from structured training is functional. So either taking part in lightly active and passive recovery strategies, but one of the fundamentals of that is their sleep. So that's something that we can really try and make sure they get the most out of every single day, and it's probably the most controllable element of their recovery that they can do. But there are, again, considerations and challenges associated with this. So how can we actually apply these, and how can we actually be innovative with these? That's really, really important. Now, in terms of rehydration, using liquid meals is really useful immediately post-game, so that couples in with the other elements of the recovery strategies. And it's especially a time when appetite can be low in these athletes. So again, making sure that we're actually meeting those macronutrient intakes without having to put a huge strain on their willingness and their appetite to eat is a challenge. But also we can individualize some of these strategies with players who have really got high sweat rates and high sodium sweat rates. And again, if we can study those during pre-season, when we know we've got particularly hot and humid conditions, we can make considerations and nudge them towards particular fluid replacement strategies immediately post-game. Probably the most exciting and interesting aspect of these, and where we can really innovate around their acute phase recovery, is in terms of repair. Now, these athletes undergo severe muscle damage in terms of eccentric and exercise-induced muscle damage, but they also have got the element, because of a collision sport, in terms of impact-induced muscle damage as well. So we're also going to try and aim to reduce the muscle soreness they get from this, but also try and reduce that acute inflammatory processes which are going to occur immediately post-game. And if we can potentially do that using adjuncts like curcumin, which has got some really promising research now in terms of reducing muscle soreness and reducing some of those inflammatory markers, then that can try and contribute to their recovery post-game. In terms of then refueling, again, the considerations we have to have, again, through the week are to make sure that players who have low game involvement need to be really mindful. So if a player arrives to play and be available to play 80 minutes, but ends up being on the substitutes bench and only plays 15, 20 minutes, they need to adjust their strategy post-game, because we can't overfuel, and then that's going to interrupt other aspects of their recovery. The other important thing to remember is, when is their next glycogen-limited exercise bout? So they're going to have a complete day's rest post-match, and they're not really going to be in a position where their glycogen stores are going to be really tapped into probably 48 hours after the match. So again, depending on what those needs are, we can build strategies around them. But again, getting the first 3 meals post-match in that acute phase right is really crucial for those players who've played 60 to 80 minutes of match time. Finally, the rest aspect, again, caffeine as an ergogenic aid in match play is regularly used, and that can also be coupled with anxiety around performance post-match. So can these be blockers to how efficient their rest is? Well, absolutely. So how can we improve sleep quality is another huge key to our recovery strategies, both in the acute and moving through into the chronic phases of recovery across the season. So really, as I mentioned, this innovative aspects we can try and use. Something we've incorporated into our recovery strategies being the use of HydroCurc, so the really highly bioavailable curcumin extract, and we've used that in several of players immediately post-game and throughout training during the week. Now, the reasons for this are primary and secondary outcomes. So the collision sport athletes are renowned for overuse of medication, especially around painkillers and anti-inflammatory, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, because of ongoing niggles and injuries, as I'll speak about a little bit later. So by trying to use natural products to be incorporated into their recovery strategies and reduce this abuse of any medication means that we can have the primary effects of reducing that inflammatory process and muscle soreness, but then we can also have a knock-on effect to improve any aspects of gut health which might also be affected negatively by the overuse of medication. So we've got primary and secondary health outcomes that we're trying to achieve. I think it's really important to be aware as well that for years now, polyphenol supplementation post-match play with things like cherry juice and tart cherry juice concentrates has been very, very popular. But I think over the last couple of years, we've really begun to question the efficacy of this, especially recent studies by Abbott in football, and a really excellent piece of work from James Morahan, who has shown really quite clearly that in rugby league athletes, these polyphenol-rich foods, which we can incorporate into the athlete's normal daily diet, is sufficient to get a positive effect. There's no significant difference between ensuring that athletes are getting a wide range of polyphenol-rich foods in their diet, rather than having to take cherry juice concentrates and adding a load in terms of supplementation. It's not really that effective. So I think looking at substances now which can have a really high bioavailability and be really excited by the prospects of this area. And I think with what we've used with the HydroCurc, it's especially exciting because it's a food-derived supplement, and because of the dispersion technology, we know that it's going to be available, and the blood concentrations of curcumin are going to be raised. So again, this can lead to reducing that inflammatory process immediately post-game, especially when we've got short turnarounds and when we're in the thick of the annual Premiership tournament, with games coming thick and fast throughout the season. So the second aspect of recovery I'd like to talk about is really one which I think goes ignored. I mean, a lot of the time we really focus on those foundations of acute recovery immediately post-match play. But when it comes to actually a continuous season, this 9-month season which the players undergo, we need to really keep them healthy and well throughout. And actually, those chronic aspects of recovery are probably more important across the whole season to maintain performance. So why is energy availability so important? Well, we know that low energy availability throughout the week is a significant risk factor for infection in elite athletes. That's been well documented. Our ultimate goal as a squad is to minimize the days lost to infection throughout the season. If that happens and we start to lose players to infections and becoming unwell, the reduced training volume that they are exposed to is only going to heighten their risk of injury. And also the quality of training sessions is going to be depleted as soon as you start to lose numbers within a squad team sport. We also know that, again, a secondary outcome is that making sure that carbohydrate availability post-exercise is adequate means that we're going to ensure that bone health and bone metabolic response to exercise is maximized as well. So again, another aspect of their overall health is really governed by getting this energy availability right. Now, in many sports, this can be really quite tough to achieve, but especially in collision sports. So some excellent work from James Morahan, again, earlier through his PhD thesis, and Nessan Costello as well, really showed that energy expenditure and total energy expenditure seems to be increased in these collision sport athletes around collision. And an aspect of my current research, which I'm particularly interested in, and it's part of my PhD work on my first paper that was published this year, and we really managed to show as well that the fundamental aspects of that energy requirements in terms of resting metabolic rate are significantly increased immediately post-game. So we worked with the elite players immediately post-game, and we took measures of resting metabolic rate every single day of the week and looked at how this changed over a competitive match week. And we can see that at game day +1, so the following day after the game, and again at game day +3, we have this significant increase in resting metabolic rate. And we need to account for this because, again, fueling this recovery process is a fundamental part of their health and well-being, as well as them being prepared for the following week. And when we saw increases in RMR as much as 600 to 1,000 calories, this is huge increases in energy requirement these athletes need. So to maximize their recovery, we need to make sure that this is covered. So adjusting their energy intake and their food choices, especially in those athletes that undergo high levels of collision, have become a real part of our chronic recovery strategies week to week. This has a huge knock-on effect as well, because we want to try and maintain body composition. Our performance model that I spoke about earlier on really is fundamental that high levels of muscle mass are maintained throughout the season. And we periodize training and periodize their nutrition to make sure that we can maintain this balance to allow their acceleration and their velocity to be maintained at their highest levels throughout the year. So again, we know that several resistance training sessions each week are really important. So the players have 3 exposures each week. And obviously their total protein intake is going to be a primary goal. But to again enable them to do this, we need to make sure we present them with opportunities throughout the day, timed around training, resistance training sessions to maximize adaptation to those sessions. And again, using those concurrent training models as well, prioritizing lower and whole body strength exercises early in the training week when we've got a low running volume and intensity, means again, we can try and maintain all that muscle mass and maintain body composition throughout the season. The other fundamental part of strength training is that if we can make sure they are exposed to resistance training sessions consistently throughout the season, we know that their risk of injury is going to be decreased. This becomes a kind of vicious circle, because when they're playing every single week, we know from great work from Fletcher et al. In 2016, when they looked at perception of soreness levels in rugby league players, that these players are in pain pretty consistently throughout a season. It improves week on week towards match day again, but again, after match play, they see really high levels of muscle soreness consistently. And the knock-on effect of this can be that they then can't complete the strength training sessions because they're hampered by niggling injury, which then reduces that overall load they're exposed to and heightens their injury chances. So it really is this continuous cycle. So to keep players fit, well, healthy and on the pitch, we need to be able to manage some of these niggling injuries and this pain throughout the season. And particular injuries are in soft tissue around tendon health as well. So this is a really nice case study which we used at one of the second rows. So these players do a lot of jumping. They're under a high level of jumping load as well as physical load throughout the week. And on the x-axis, we've got the time. So we ran this over about 15 weeks of the season. When we started it, this player was really hampered by knee tendinopathy. He was unable to complete full training load, and he was unable to do his requisite number of jumps during the week. So he was really limited in what he was able to do. So we approached it as a combined medical physical team at the club, and we intervened by using the HydroCurc curcumin extract and the Levagen Plus products from Gentle. Now, the Levagen Plus is palmitoyl ethanolamide, which is a natural anti-inflammatory. It's an endogenous anti-inflammatory substance in the body. And there's some excellent research and meta-analysis that I'd really push you to go and have a look at around pain and joint pain especially. So we used this with the player because he was experiencing quite high levels of pain upon waking. Upon taking the supplementation, we saw a reduction in pain, the analgesic effect from the Levagen Plus, and that allowed him to complete more training earlier in the day. So by completing more training and using some of the isometric techniques to improve his tendinopathy with the physio team, he was able to complete this training volume, and this was able to be increased over time. That helped with the remodeling of his soft tissue and his connective tissue, coupled with some of the collagen supplementation as well. And this led to a reduction in pain throughout the period of time. So as you can see, once we get to about sort of 6-7 weeks, there's a really significant drop in the pain he was feeling during training. He was still getting some soreness in the mornings, but between the supplementation protocols and the physio interventions, he was able to then start to complete more and more training. And over time, during this case study, when he started in October, he was only able to complete that training load. And then once we got to 3-4 months later, he was able to complete his full training load. So month on month, he was able to increase the load and recover from the injury, which meant that he could then complete more training. Once we could get him back to a full training load, it was still an ongoing process, but he could then carry on competing at his best each week, but also completing his full training load. As I've mentioned before, sleep is really the most controllable aspect in these athletes of their recovery. We can nudge them towards particular active and passive techniques, but really fundamentally sleep is something that we can really try and maximize because they do it every single night. So if we can help them maximize this, then we're only going to be able to maximize their recovery from training and all the exposures to infection, which are also going to be part of their daily lives. So if we can make sure their immune systems are as healthy as possible and that they're recovering as best from the collisions that they're undergoing, then this is going to result in, again, fewer days lost throughout the season. Now, we can work heavily with athletes around their bedtime routines. So sleep hygiene techniques, making sure that they're in a cool, dark room, reducing blue light and making sure they're getting away from screens, making sure that their sleep prep and routine around using breathing exercises or hot and cold shower aspects to change core temperature. All these little tools that we've got around sleep routine and these sleep hygiene aspects are really, really key, and we can educate them around that and try and get into a fixed routine. But often we also see that there's real issues around sleep latency and sometimes soreness around particular injuries at bedtime. So what we did is we again used the Levagen Plus product because the analgesic effect, which has been highlighted in the meta-analyses as well, and there's a potential there for it to also improve this sleep latency. So to do this, we took a group of players who had sleep hygiene education and were trying to maximize their sleep, but still having issues around this. And we measured this using the Pittsburgh Sleep Questionnaire. I think it's an excellent questionnaire. It's been validated methodologically to look at sleep and all aspects of sleep, whereas some of the athlete-specific sleep questionnaires tend to push athletes towards leading questions, which can often mean that they can give you the right answer. So I like using the Pittsburgh Sleep Questionnaire because I think it gives you a wide variety of questions to look at all aspects of sleep. So the intervention was to use 2 capsules, or I think 700 milligrams of the Levagen Plus product before bedtime, about 45 minutes before bed. And then we remeasured using the Pittsburgh Sleep Questionnaire again after about 4 to 6 weeks. And again, we did a second remeasure at another 4 to 6 weeks later in the group. And what we could see is there was a really positive drop in terms of their sleep questionnaire score. So a score of 5 is thought of as normal. So again, we've still got some work to do with some of these athletes. But again, the number of them who were above that score of 5, which was all of them at the initial time, we now got over half of them below there by the second remeasure. And again, this is a continual process to make sure we get that. But the specific aspects of sleep, which it seemed to really help with, were depth of sleep, so their perceived depth of sleep, but also their latency, so the time it takes for them to really get to sleep as part of their wind down routine was significantly reduced, which led to improved recovery throughout the season. So it's quite a whistle-stop tour of what we try and do, but I think it's really important to look at both aspects of recovery throughout a season. In team sports, the acute phase of recovery is almost taken for granted. It's what we do immediately post-competition. It's making sure that we prioritize those 4 R's and that they're a foundation to build innovation upon. And we make sure that the messaging to athletes at a time which is highly stimulated and they're under high stress are really maximized, and we can get those simple monitoring tools in place and ensure that we're rehydrating, we're refueling, and we're repairing that muscle tissue. But in order to perform throughout an entire season, chronic recovery aspects, I think, are where things are really exciting, really interesting. How can we maximize that recovery and allow them to perform consistently across an entire 9-month season? These are the aspects that we need to think about. So especially in collision sport athletes, making sure that the energy cost of recovery is accounted for, and realizing that it doesn't finish with the sleep on a match day and that recovery continues all the way through the match week leading into the next competition. Because at the end of it, if we can increase an athlete's availability to train and reduce those days lost, the knock-on effects around them being consistently available to perform every week and healthy is only going to be positive. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you for the invitation to speak. I'd like to thank the players at Gloucester Rugby Club for their time and their commitment to some of the research aspects that we've taken on over the last couple of years. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to the performance medical team at Gloucester Rugby. I love working as part of this team because we have an excellent group of practitioners who communicate brilliantly to come up with some of these solutions. And then GenCore as well for their continued support and enabling us to keep progressing these recovery strategies with the players. So thank you very much.